But had he been savage and ugly to my family, my guests and my slaves, I couldn't have endured it. He was not. He seemed particularly to delight in the visitors, but he said we must spare no expense where our families were concerned, and he seemed to push luxury upon his father to an almost ludicrous point. The old blind man must be told constantly how fine and expensive were his bed jackets and robes, and what important draperies had just been fixed to his bed, and what French and Spanish wines we had in the cellar, and how much the plantation yielded, even in bad years, when the coast talked of abandoning the indigo production altogether and going into sugar. But then at other times he would bully the old man, as I mentioned. He would erupt into such rage that the old man whimpered like a child. "Don't I take care of you in baronal splendor?" Lestat would shout at him. "Don't I provide for your every want? Stop whining to me about going to church or old friends, such nonsense. Your old friends are dead. Why don't you die and leave me my bankroll in peace?" The old man would cry softly that these things meant so little to him in old age. He would have been content on his little farm forever. I wanted often to ask him later, where was this farm? From where did you come to Louisiana? To get some clue to the place where Lestat might have known another vampire. But I didn't dare bring these things up, lest the old man start crying and Lestat become enraged. But these fits were no more frequent than the periods near obsquescent's kindness, when Lestat would bring his father's supper on a tray and feed him patiently, while talking of the weather and New Orleans news and the activities of my mother and sister. It was obvious that a great gulf existed between father and son, both in education and refinement, but how it came about I could not quite guess. And from this whole matter I achieved a somewhat constant detachment. Consistent detachment. Constant. Oh my God. Existence, as I've said, was possible. There was always the promise behind his mocking smile that he knew great things or terrible things, and had commerce with levels of darkness I could not possibly guess at. And all the time he belittled me and attacked me for my love of the senses, my reluctance to kill, and the near swoon which killing could produce in me. He laughed uproariously when I discovered that I could see myself in a mirror, and that crosses had no effect upon me, and would taunt me with sealed lips when I asked about God or the devil. "I'd like to meet the devil some night," he said once, with a malignant smile. "I'd chase him from here to the wilds of the Pacific. I am the devil." And when I was aghast at this, he went into peals of laughter. But what happened was simply that in my distaste for him, I came to ignore and suspect him, and yet study him with a detached fascination. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at his wrist, from which I'd drawn my vampire life, and I would fall into such a stillness that my mind seemed to leave my body, or rather my body become my mind. And then he would see me and stare at me with a stubborn ignorance of what I felt and longed to know, and reaching over, shake me roughly out of it. I bore this with no overt detachment unknown to me in mortal life, and came to understand this as a part this is as part of a vampire's nature, that I might sit at home at Pont de Lac and think for hours of my brother's mortal life, and see it short and rounded in unfallible darkness. Understanding now the vain and senseless wasting passion with which I'd mourned his loss and turned on other mortals like a maddened animal. All that confusion was then like dancers, frenzied in a fog, and now in this strange vampire nature, I felt a profound sadness. I did not brood over this. Let me not give you that impression, for brooding would have been to me the most terrible waste, but rather I looked around me at all the mortals that I knew and saw all life as precious, condemning all fruitless guilt and passion that would let it slip through the fingers like sand. It was only now as a vampire I did come to know my sister, forbidding her the plantation, the city life which she so needed in order to own time of life and her own beauty, and come to marry, not brood for our lost brother and going away, or become a nursemaid for our mother. And I provided for them all they might need or want, finding even the most trivial request worth my immediate attention. My sister laughed at the transformation in me when we would meet at night, and I would take her from our flat out to the narrow wooden streets to walk along the tree-lined levee in the moonlight, savoring the orange blossoms and the caressing warmth, talking for hours of her most secret thoughts and dreams, those little fantasies she dared tell no one, and would even whisper to me when we sat in the dim-lit parlor entirely alone. And I would see her sweet and palpable before me, a shimmering, precious creature, soon to grow old, soon to die, soon to lose these moments in that intangible promise to us wrongly as immortality, as if it were our own very birthright, which we could not come to grasp the meaning until this time of our middle life, when we looked on only as many years ahead as already lay behind us, when every moment must be first known, then savored. It was detachment that made this possible, a sublime loneliness with which Lestat and I moved through the world of mortal men, and all material troubles passed from us. I should tell you the practical nature of it. Lestat had always known how to steal from victims chosen for sumptuous dress and other promising signs of extravagance, but the greater problems of shelter and secrecy had been for him a terrible struggle. I suspected that beneath his gentleman's veneer he was painfully ignorant of the most simple financial matters, but I was not, and so he could acquire cash at any moment, and I could invest it. If he were not picking the pocket of a dead man in an alley, he was at the greatest gambling tables and the richest salons of the city, using his vampire keenness to suck gold and dollars and deeds of property from the young planters' sons, who found him deceptive in his friendship and alluring in his charm. But this had never given him the life he wanted, and so for that he had ushered me into the preternatural world, that he might acquire an investor and manager for whom these skills of mortal life became most valuable in this life after. But let me describe New Orleans as it was then, as it was to become, so you can understand how simple our lives were. There was no city in America like New Orleans. It was filled not only with the French and Spanish of all classes, who had formed in part its peculiar aristocracy, but later with immigrants of all kinds, the Irish and the German in particular. Then there were not only the black slaves, yet unhomogenized and fantastical in their different tribal garb and manners, but the great growing class of the free people of color, those marvelous people of our mixed blood and that of the islands, who produced a magnificent and unique cast of craftsmen, artists, poets, and renowned feminine beauty. And then there were the Indians, who covered the levee on the summer days, selling herbs and crafted wares, and drifting through all through this medley of languages and colors were the people of the port, the sailors of the ships, who came in great waves to spend their money in the cabarets, to buy for the night the beautiful woman, both dark and light, to dine on the best of Spanish and French cooking, drink the imported wines of the world. Then add to these, within years after my transformation, the Americans, who built the city up river from the old French quarter with magnificent Grecian houses which gleamed in the moonlight like temples, and of course the planters, always the planters, coming to town with their families in shining laudes to buy evening gowns and silver and gems, to crowd the narrow streets on the way to the old French opera house and the Theatre d'Orleans and the St. Louis Cathedral, from whose open doors came the chants of high mass over the crowds, to the Place d'Armes on Sundays, over the noise and bickering of the French market, over the silent, ghostly drift of the ships along the raised waters of the Mississippi, which flowed against the levee above the ground of New Orleans itself, so that the ships appeared to float across the sky. This was New Orleans, a magical and magnificent place to live, in which a vampire richly dressed and gracefully walking through the pools of light of one gas lamp after another might attract no more notice in the evening than hundreds of other exotic creatures. If he attracted any at all, if anyone stopped to whisper behind a fan, that man, how pale, how he gleams, how he moves. It's not natural. A city in which a vampire might be gone before the words had even past the lips, seeking out the alleys in which he could see like a cat, the darkened bars in which the sailors slept with their heads on the tables, great high-ceilinged hotel rooms where a lone figure might sit, her feet upon an embroidered cushion, her legs covered with a lace counterpane, her head bent under the tarnished light of a single candle, never seeing the great shadow move across the plaster flowers on the ceiling, never seeing the long white fingers reached to press the fragile flame. Remarkable, if for nothing else because of this, that all of those men and women who came to stay for any reason left behind them some monument, some structure of marble and brick and stone that still stands, so that even when the gas lamps went out and the planes came in and the office buildings crowded the blocks of Canal Street, something irreducible of beauty and romance remained. Not in every street, perhaps, but in so many that the landscape is for me the landscape of those times always, and walking now in the starlit streets of the quarter or the garden district, I am in those times again. I suppose that is the nature of the monument. Be it a small house or a mansion or Corinthian columns and wrought iron lace, the monument does not say that this or that man walked here. Not that what he felt in one time, in one spot, continues. The moon that rose over New Orleans then still rises. As long as the monuments stand, it still rises. The feeling, at least here and there, it remains the same. The vampire appeared sad. He sighed, as if he doubted what he had just said. "What was it?" he asked suddenly, as if he were slightly tired. "Yes, money. Lestat and I had to make money. And I was telling you that he could steal. But it was the investment afterwards that mattered. What we accumulated we must use, but I go ahead of myself. I killed animals, but I'll get to that in a moment. Lestat killed humans all the time. Sometimes 2 or 3 a night, sometimes more. He would drink from one, just enough to satisfy a momentary thirst, and then go on to another. The better the human, as he would say in his vulgar way, the more he liked it. A fresh young girl was his favorite food for the first of the evening, but that triumphant kill for Lestat was a young man. A young man around your age would have appealed to him in particular. Me? The boy whispered. He had leaned forward on his elbows to peer into the vampire's eyes, and now he drew up. Yes, the vampire went on, as if he hadn't observed the boy's change of expression. You see, they represented the greatest loss to Lestat, because they stood on the threshold of the maximum possibility of life. Of course, Lestat didn't understand this himself. I came to understand it. Lestat understood nothing. I shall give you a perfect example of what Lestat liked. Up the river from us was the Fenrir plantation, a magnificent spread of land which had great hopes of making a fortune in sugar. Just shortly after the refining process had been invented, I presume you know sugar was refined in Louisiana. There is something perfect and ironic about it. This land which I loved producing refined sugar, I mean this more unhappily than I think you know. This refined sugar is a poison. It was like the essence of life in New Orleans, so sweet that it can be fatal, so richly enticing that all other values are forgotten. But as I was saying, up river from us was the Freniers, a great old French family which had produced in this generation 5 young women and 1 young man. Now, 3 of the young women were destined not to marry, but 2 were young enough still, and all depended upon the young man. He was still to manage the plantation as I had done for my mother and sister. He was to negotiate marriages, to put together dowries when the entire fortune of the place rode precariously on the next year's sugar crop. He was to bargain, fight, and keep at a distance the entire material world for the world of Fenrir. Lestat decided he wanted him, and when fate alone nearly cheated Lestat, he went wild. He risked his own life to get the Fenrir boy, who had become involved in a duel. He had insulted a young Spanish Creole at a ball. The whole thing was nothing, really, but like most young Creoles, this one was willing to die for nothing. They were both willing to die for nothing. The Frenier household was in an uproar. You must understand, Lestat knew this perfectly. Both of us had hunted the Fenrir plantation. Lestat for slaves and chicken thieves, and me for animals. You were killing only animals? Yes, but I'll come to that later, as I said. We both knew the plantation, and I had indulged in one of the greatest pleasures of a vampire, that of watching people unbeknownst to them. I knew the Fenrir sisters, as I knew the magnificent rose trees around my brother's oratory. They were a unique group of women, each in her own way as smart as the brother, and one of them, I shall call her Babette, was not only as smart as her brother, but far wiser. Yet none had been educated to care for the plantation. None understood even the simplest facts about its financial state. All were totally dependent upon young Fenrir, and all knew it, and so, larded with their love for him, their passionate belief that he hung the moon, and that any conjugal love they might ever know would only be a pale reflection of their love for him, larded with this as a desperation as strong as the will to survive. If Fenrir died in the duel, the plantation would collapse, its fragile economy, a life of splendor based on the perennial mortgaging of the next year's crop, was in his hands alone. So you can imagine the panic and misery in the Frenier household the night that the son went to town to fight the appointed duel. And now picture Lestat gnashing his teeth like a comic opera devil because he was not going to kill the young Frenier. You mean that you felt for the Frenier women? I felt for them totally, said the vampire. Their position was agonizing, and I felt for the boy. That night he locked himself in his father's study and made a will. He knew full well that if he fell under the rapier at 4 a.m. the next morning, his family would fall with him. He deplored his situation and yet could do nothing to help it. To run out on the duel would not only mean social ruin for him, but would probably have been impossible. The other young man would have pursued him until he was forced to fight. When he left the plantation at midnight, he was staring into the face of death itself, and with the character of man who, having one path to follow, has resolved to follow it with perfect courage, he would either kill the Spanish boy or die. It was unpredictable despite all his skill. His face reflected a depth of feeling and wisdom I'd never seen on the face of any of Lestat's struggling victims. I had my first battle with Lestat then and there. I prevented him from killing the boy for months, and now he meant to kill him before the Spanish boy could.